guys, thank you so much for joining me in another video. So as you can tell, based on the title, I'm doing something a little bit different today. I recently did a couple videos. So there was one video I did on Sade's personal style, and it's more sort of about her style, largely in the 1980s. I also did a video on the history of Celine, looking into it as a sportswear brand. I kind of went down a rabbit hole of looking at images in the 1980s. While I think the 80s is truly one of the most opulent, decadent decades in like recent times, the shoulder pads, the bright colors, the silhouettes, it was an incredible era. Some of the most incredible looks in fashion history occurred during the 1980s. No one is disputing that. And then in the 90s, we saw peak minimalism, some of the best minimalist fashion. There were kind of these rumblings of a new guard, a new shift, that if it weren't for these designers, if it weren't for these movements, if it weren't for these particular styles, even like certain cultural references, I don't think we would have the aesthetics of the row the way we have it today, or some of the works from old Celine. Again, I don't want to say that the 1980s was a minimalist period, but I want to talk about these movements and designers that were happening in the 1980s and how they would influence further decades. Let's talk about the sartorial style of Armani. So when I think of Armani, I don't think like minimalism. Today's standards, I definitely think of fancy guys and suits, but Armani really did some interesting things with men's silhouettes, but also women's silhouettes as well. We definitely see this approach to tailoring replicated in a lot of women's wear minimalist brands, interestingly enough. I found this quote from Grailed. Armani removed the internal padding of his suit jackets, shifted from traditional fabrics to linen, and moved from the harsh blacks and blues of tradition to the ease of beige and brown. The 1980s man was bolder, smoother, and sexier. And at the center of it all were the letters GA. What we saw really was like a muted color palette, sumptuous folds, plays with proportion, definitely a huge inspiration with menswear. Check out this account, Permanent Style, like their blog post. Whole looks are built off of single colors, the tight focus of making slight contrasts in tone much more dramatic. Texture is used to create contrast. A Donegal tweed paired with a surprisingly robust looking shepherd's check shirt creates unexpected harmony between the pattern sizes. Elsewhere, the heavy stripe of an overcoat lies over the deep diagonal line of a Calvary twill trouser, and a chunky polo plays off the marl of a covert cloth sports coat. The whole look is rich and tactile despite being shot in monochrome. We're seeing a lot of these billowing folds, this interesting cinched at the waist silhouette, extended shoulder lines, deeper pleated pants, generous arm folds, very beautiful deep drapes that really prevent you from feeling constrained. It's extremely relaxed, very lightweight, and very generous. And I really can't help but when I look at these collections, I think the row, I think of Celine, old Celine. There is more, I feel, an affinity with the 80s Armani years. To me, the essence of Armani, especially in the 80s, is really going strong with a lot of these more modern minimalist brands. Another cultural moment here, we have American Gigolo. So this is a film starring Lauren Hutton and Richard Gere. Armani was behind a lot of the outfits in this. And of course, we have the iconic Bottega pouch. While I wouldn't call Armani this conventionally minimalist brand, I don't think it is. It's so undeniable the influence this brand, especially in the 1980s, the influence this brand has had on a lot of these modern minimalist brands today. Like, of course, the tailoring is even more minimal. It's a little bit cleaner, but there's some collections from the row where I think they delve into the sumptuous folds in a more abstract way. There's something still a little bit more traditional about these looks, whereas I think the row will kind of abstract, and I think Phoebe Philo would sort of abstract and play with the silhouette in different ways. There's definitely the Armani 80s that I see in a lot of these brands. I cannot talk about Phoebe Philo, I cannot talk about the row without really talking about Jil Sander. So we're gonna talk about her in the 1980s. Yes, I did talk about her in the 90s. Some of her most iconic moments were in the 90s. And she was someone that didn't really use the term minimalism to describe her fashion. It was really for her about purity. It was more of an emphasis on the quality of materials and an emphasis on like clean design. Yes, she's known for her work in the 90s, but we also have to look at her work in the 80s and even further back, right? In 1973, she actually presented her women's ready-to-wear line with the concept called Less and Lux. The collection used a series of monochrome, streamlined jackets, pants, was a bit of a response to the more maximal aesthetics of that era. And when we talk about purity, Amy Spindler for the New York Times writes this: "What sets the minimalists on this page above the rest is their deceit and their conceit. Deceit because these clothes look so simple, but can in fact be the most difficult. Many are cut on the bias, diagonally across the grain of the fabric, and the bias cut makes them drape. The conceit is the richness of the fabric. There is nothing plain about chiffon backed with silk or cashmere woven into the rib of the knit sweater." Sander herself described the classical wardrobe as cunning. I think it's just very interesting when we think about this idea of deceit and conceit, and we think about a brand like Bottega Veneta. Matthew Blasey has described this concept called the perverse banality of his collections, whether it's taking the most ordinary thing like jeans, being sort of this optical illusion, making it out of leather, but it looks like jeans. He plays with this idea of using the most high quality materials to represent the most mundane of things, but it feels very excessive at the same time. I feel like there's something just very highbrow conceptual art about like Bottega Veneta, more like conceptual art applied to fashion with this kind of subtle, feels like it's kind of like an inside joke. Anyways, Jil Sander didn't go that extreme, but that's what I'm kind of feeling when we talk about this idea of deceit and conceit. And that concept of design purity is kind of flipped in a way with him. So I think it's very interesting. We could also go into other regions. I did my video on Celine as sort of like a sportswear brand. In the 1980s, there were a lot of other brands that were taking sort of a sportswear approach. But I do think the Americans, their greatest contribution to fashion is sportswear. Think of like sportswear now versus 100 years ago was totally different. It was growing in America, emphasized comfort, an embrace of technology. I'm just gonna read this quote from the Met Museum. "Sportswear was committed to making ready-to-wear and affordable fashion realistic and attractive to women of the epoch of the Great Depression through the American world of hegemony. The significant designers of this era did not seek the grand style and the refinements of traditional fashion authority, and they exercised remarkable independence from French couture. Significantly, they rethought fashion from its very roots, not simply paring away some of the accretions of traditional prettiness, but establishing a new standard for practical modern style in accord with the lives of the women of their era. Furthermore, the chief impetus came from women designers, not from men. The sportswear tradition in America includes male manufacturers and a few early pioneers such as Sidney Ragg and later John Weitz. But the driving force of fashion's fresh invention resides with the women who answered women's needs. We live today indebted to McCardle, Cashin, Hawes, Wilkins, Lesser, and Maxwell, and other women who liberated American fashion from the thraldom of Parisian design. These designers established the modern dress code, letting play suits and other activewear outfits suffice for casual clothing, allowing pants to enter the wardrobe, often as an alternative in an outfit, also offering a skirt and prizing rationalism and versatility in dress, in contradiction to dressing for an occasion or allotment of the day. Fashion in America was logical and answerable to the will of the women who wore it. Implicitly or explicitly, American fashion addressed a democracy, whereas traditional-based fashion was authoritarian and imposed women willing or not." So this was like obviously before the 1980s. And in the 1980s, American sportswear expanded even more. When we think of the designer Donna Karan, who created fashion for that urban, sophisticated, modern woman, in 1985, she presented her first collection called 7 Easy Pieces. So these were about interchangeable separates for largely women, career women, working women with busy lives, emphasizing a bodysuit, which could be mixed with a selection of skirts, pants, unstructured blazers, blouses, to create this sort of effortless, professional, but also had this like subtle sexiness to it. This collection was really critically acclaimed. It was something that you could wear day to night. And of course, I have to also highlight the other great American icons that dominated the 1980s. Brands like Ralph Lauren, Calvin Klein, and Perry Ellis were known known for their sportswear designs. They often used all natural materials, fibers, wool, cotton, and linen. Norma Kamali in the 1980s created garments from sweatshirt materials. And I want to talk about this one specific designer, Zoran, who's known for his very extremely minimalist garments that followed the same approach to American sportswear, largely neutrals, maybe some use of color here and there. The emphasis was on quality, using the most premium materials, silk, linen, and cashmere. And Susie Menkes in 1993, with the whole 90s minimal boom, described Zoran as one of the early prophets of the 1990s minimalist look that we would see. Less is more, but through sportswear. And finally, let's talk about Japan. So Japan was in the 1980s. We just look at it at like a political level, right? Japan reached like this new height of financial prosperity. It was becoming a global power. It was a country that suffered post World War II, but it was advancing in many sectors, including technology. While the focus of this video is minimal aesthetics, the Japan aesthetics in the 1980s like really went in so many directions. I'm just like taking a like small portion of what was going on in Japan. I'm just gonna read this quote here. Their clothes, unlike all those made in the West, failed to comply with all the rules of composition pursued up to the moment because they no longer simply served to cover the body, but had to express a concept. The clothes were different in the fabrics, often worn in the asymmetrical cuts, in the absence of decorations, in the shapes and colors, austere, mainly white, black, and gray. The term deconstructivism began to be used to indicate those garments with unusual volumes. Traditional garments were unmade and reassembled, giving a sense of independence and not of Western reasoning. From an economic point of view, these collections were simply a disaster. In Europe, they shocked the critics who did not understand them, but had an enormous success of fame. The style, which at first was defined as, quote, minimal, became the anti-hedonistic philosophy adopted by Belgian designers, such as Martin Margiela, defined at the times by the French La Mode Destroy, and later by the Six of Antwerp. The reference to Japan, especially that of Rei Kawakubo, can be found in the entire conceptual philosophy of Margiela, starting with first collection in 1988, in which he presented the iconic tabi shoes, which in many ways denoted the symbol of the Maison. Tabi are actually a Japanese invention dating back to the 15th century, a time when cotton was imported from China, and the Japanese began to make socks in this material by dividing the big toe from the rest of the toes so that you can wear traditional sandals. So anyways, that's my video. It was kind of random, just looking at these different regions, different designers, how they approached fashion in the 1980s. And I always think it's very interesting to see what is the opposite direction of prevailing periods of fashion, because it's always that startup period where it's so incredibly creative. Even just like the Y2K era, right? Like such an amazing era, maximal period of fashion. Yeah, we have someone like Margiela at Hermes doing some of the most incredible minimal looks, right? There's this bag I'm obsessed with. It looks kind of like a Phoebe Philo era, like Celine belt bag. I always think it's very interesting to look at the opposite direction. What is going against the grain of fashion right now? And looking at the creative forces behind sort of more subversive movements. Kind of a random video. I just scratched the surface here and this video is getting too long. Thank you so much for joining. I appreciate you being here and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.